So I'm David Clarke. I'm a soils and farming systems specialist at NIAB. I've been working with David Jones and AHDB on the Strategic Farm East Work Package 3 since 2023 autumn. And we've been looking at nitrogen use efficiency on farm through two sort of main field experiments. So one experiment that we've been helping David with is looking at the efficiency of some alternative nitrogen products. So David on farm has been using a polymer urea foliar applied nitrogen product in replacement of his typical 40 kilograms of soil applied nitrogen as his third N timing. So to help test the efficiency of this, we set up a 3-rep replicated tramline experiment on Ravensgrove field last year. Quite a lot of work went in with David to identify this field. So we used some long-term yield map data to ensure that where we were going to set the trial up had very little spatial variation within the trial. We then also used Sentinel-2 data, which Yara kindly provided in their app farm tool to identify before we did any treatment effects. So before we applied our soil applied N and our polymer urea product, we made sure that area had pretty even nitrogen uptake up until that third nitrogen timing at the end of April, beginning of May. And then we imposed those treatments. So obviously our first treatment was a control, which had no final N application, whether that be the polymer urea foliar applied or soil applied N. We then had a farm standard application of about 40 kilograms of soil applied nitrogen, liquid nitrogen, and then the MZ28 product, which at the rate advertised to replace that similar soil applied M. We then used yield monitor data to monitor the response of that and grain protein data from each plot to look at grain nitrogen uptake. And generally what we saw in that 1 year's trial, again, we're repeating this over this year and going forward to build up a stronger data set, but we didn't see any response from the polymer urea product over no applied nitrogen. And we saw a small yield increase of about 0.3 tonnes a hectare where we applied soil applied nitrogen. Now, that being said, spring 2024 was notably quite wet and going into early summer. Therefore, we would probably expect soil applied nitrogen to be as efficient as it could be compared to, say, a drier spring that we may have experienced this year, where those polymer urea products that are applied to the leaf surface may be able to improve the efficiency compared to soil applied N that might struggle to be uptaken by the plant. So that's why it's important to do these experiments over a number of years where we've got a wide range of weather conditions that are more typical of the long-term average. A second aspect of what David's been looking at is through other projects that the farm and the foundation have been involved on at Morley and NIAB have been involved in, such as the Morley SAMS project, which has been monitoring crops and soils across 30 long-term monitoring sites across farm, have identified that there's quite large spatial and temporal variation in nitrogen use efficiency. Currently, the farm isn't using any variable rate technology. So with that in mind, we're using some of the data from the SAMS project and setting up fully replicated nitrogen response experiments in different management zones across the farm each year. Now in 2024, we used Old Hall Peacefield. Now, unfortunately, it was a reasonably poor establishment with the field due to some really wet conditions and a little bit of residual herbicide damage. So we've continued this year and we've gone into Mansfield. So we've got 4 experiments in 4 very distinct yield performance zones within the field. And through the SAMS data, we know that this yield variation is driven by a whole range of things. There's one zone that's very, very light with some sand and gravel at depth, so much lower available water capacity. We've got a high yielding zone that we know, performs very well, higher available water capacity. But then we've also got an equivalent high yielding zone to the north of the field that we know has got higher organic matter from a legacy of some long-term grass. Now, this hasn't been in grass for at least 40 years. We know this through aerial photography, but we know the organic matter is about 1 to 1.5% higher than the rest of the field. So by setting up these nitrogen response experiments on each of these zones, we can see what the variation in optimal N is from an economic point of view. And then by doing that, we're testing loads of different monitoring and assessment methods to see which one of those can help us retrospectively have got to that figure. So we're looking at tractor mounted N sensors to see how the spatial variation in N uptake at each timing links back to N optimal within that zone. So saying actually, we should be feeding the good bits or laying off nitrogen on some of the poorer bits, whatever that might be on these soils. We're looking at a modelling based approach, so using some biophysical crop models with some historic weather data and the soil profile data put into them to see, well, what do they suggest the N optimum is for these zones, and how does that compare to what we're observing with the N response experiments. We're looking at some handheld sensors. We're also looking at how a simple yield-based approach might work compared to what we're measuring in the N response experiments. And then also the farm has recently installed an NIR protein sensor on the combine, so we can look at how grain protein levels, within RB209, it suggested that for feed wheat, you could adjust nitrogen levels based on grain protein. So we're seeing if that variation in grain protein spatially might be able to help us identify where we should be applying more or less compared to those maps. So we're pulling them all together and doing sort of a wide range of testing to see how our end response data links back to these technologies and whether we can sort of identify which one performs best on this farm. And it's something that farmers might be able to do elsewhere using tramline experiments, testing these technologies using strip trials to see which ones get closer to the optimum N that was actually recorded.